It was the kind of crisp autumn morning that made you feel like you could conquer anything. The leaves had just begun their vibrant transformation, painting the town in shades of red and gold. I had planned a day of running errands, tackling my to-do list with the kind of optimism that only fall can inspire. Everything was going according to plan until I came across the car. I was driving through a less frequented part of town, cutting through shortcuts to avoid traffic. The road wound through an old industrial area, now largely forgotten and overgrown. I wasn't paying much attention until something unusual caught my eye. A car parked by the side of the road, nestled among tall weeds and partially hidden behind a dilapidated warehouse. At first glance, the car seemed out of place. It was an old sedan, its once pristine paint job now faded and peeling. The windows were grimy, and the tires were sunk slightly into the dirt, indicating it had been there for a while. But it wasn't the car's condition that caught my attention. It was the feeling of unease that washed over me as I drove past. I had an inexplicable urge to stop and investigate, even though my logical mind told me it was a bad idea. I tried to shake off the feeling and continued with my errands, but the image of the abandoned car kept nagging at me. Something about it was off, and I couldn't ignore the growing curiosity and unease that accompanied it. By the time I finished my day's tasks, the car was still on my mind. I decided I had to go back and take a closer look. When I arrived back at the spot, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the road. The once busy industrial area was now eerily quiet, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant hum of traffic. The car was still there, just as I had left it, but now it seemed even more out of place in the encroaching twilight. I parked my car a little ways down the road and walked back to the sedan. As I approached, I noticed that the driver's side door was slightly ajar. My heart started to race, a mix of curiosity and apprehension swelling within me. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to open the door and peer inside. The interior was in a state of disarray, with old papers and trash scattered across the seats. The smell of stale air and mildew hit me as I leaned in. The steering wheel was covered in a thin layer of dust, and the seats were threadbare with torn upholstery. There was nothing immediately alarming, but a sense of wrongness lingered in the air. I stepped back and glanced around, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The car looked like it hadn't been driven in years. But why would someone leave it here, abandoned in such an isolated spot? I decided to check the trunk, hoping to find some clues that might explain the car's presence. The trunk was heavy and rusty, and it took some effort to pry it open. When it finally gave way, I was met with a sight that made my stomach churn. Inside were several large duffel bags, their zippers bulging as if they were overstuffed. I hesitated before reaching in, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened one of the bags, and the contents made my blood run cold. Inside the duffel bag were various items: stacks of documents, old photographs, and several faded, well-worn books. But what struck me most was a series of disturbing photographs. They depicted different people, some smiling, some looking directly at the camera with expressions that ranged from indifferent to nervous. The most unsettling part was that many of the photos were taken in the same car. I quickly closed the duffel bag and stepped away, trying to make sense of what I had found. Why were these photos in an abandoned car? And why were they so unsettling? The realization that someone had taken these photos, possibly without the subject's knowledge, made me shiver. As I was about to leave, I noticed something else: a small leather-bound journal wedged in the corner of the trunk. I picked it up cautiously, feeling a mixture of dread and curiosity. The journal was old, its cover cracked and worn. I opened it to the first page and began to read. The entries were written in a neat, precise hand. They detailed the writer's daily activities and observations, but they grew increasingly disjointed and paranoid as I progressed through the pages. The writer mentioned feeling like they were being followed, experiencing strange occurrences, and seeing people watching them from a distance. One entry was particularly chilling. It described a plan to leave behind a trail and watch from afar, followed by a series of cryptic references to keeping secrets and observing the unsuspecting. The final entry was a hurried scrawl that read, "The car is ready. The time has come." The journal left me with more questions than answers. Who was the writer? What did they mean by "the car is ready"? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled into something deeply unsettling, something that went far beyond the simple abandonment of a vehicle. I decided to call the police, reporting the abandoned car and the disturbing findings. They arrived quickly, taking the car and its contents for investigation. I was questioned briefly, but they didn't seem particularly interested in the journal or the photographs. Their focus was on the car's registration and any potential leads related to its owner. As days passed, I heard nothing more about the car. The police didn't contact me again, and there were no news reports about the case. I tried to move on with my life, but the experience left me with a lingering sense of unease. Every time I saw a similar car or heard about an abandoned vehicle, my mind raced back to that autumn evening. The whole incident made me question the hidden aspects of our lives, the things that lurk just out of sight. The abandoned car and the journal had revealed a fragment of a story that was incomplete and disturbing. A reminder that sometimes, the things we find can lead to more questions than answers. I learned to be more cautious about my curiosity, especially when it leads to places better left unexplored. Some mysteries, I realized, are better left unsolved. And sometimes, the unknown is far more disturbing than we can ever imagine. It was a seemingly ordinary September evening when I first noticed something strange about my neighbor, Mr. Thompson. He was a quiet man, living alone in the house next door. We exchanged pleasantries occasionally, but I knew little about him. Our interactions were limited to the occasional nod or wave as we went about our daily routines. That's why I found it odd when I saw him standing at his front door, staring blankly into the street, seemingly lost in thought. The sight was unusual enough to catch my attention. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the neighborhood. But Mr. Thompson stood there as if he didn't even notice the changing light. At first, I thought nothing of it. Perhaps he was waiting for someone or lost in his thoughts. But as days passed, his behavior became increasingly peculiar. The following week, I noticed that Mr. Thompson was absent more often than usual. His house, once lively with the occasional clink of dishes or the hum of the television, fell eerily silent. The lights, which were usually on at night, remained off. I assumed he was simply away on a trip or dealing with personal matters. Yet, as the silence stretched on, my curiosity grew. One Saturday morning, I spotted a moving truck parked in his driveway. It was a small, nondescript vehicle. I watched from my window as a few men carried boxes and furniture into the truck. There was no sign of Mr. Thompson, just the workers, going about their task with a professional efficiency that only deepened my concern. Unable to contain my curiosity, I decided to approach them. As I neared the truck, one of the movers noticed me and gave a polite nod. "Are you moving?" I asked. The mover glanced at me, his expression slightly guarded. "Just clearing out some old stuff," he replied. Mr. Thompson said he was done with this place. The answer didn't sit right with me. Why would Mr. Thompson suddenly decide to clear out his belongings without a word? I pressed further. "Has he said where he's going? When he'll be back?" The mover shook his head. "I'm not sure. He didn't leave any forwarding address or details." I thanked him and returned to my house, feeling more unsettled than ever. Something about the situation didn't add up. If Mr. Thompson was moving away, why hadn't he mentioned it to anyone? That evening, I walked past his property, hoping to glean more information. Through the gaps in the fence, I noticed the yard, once meticulously maintained, was now overgrown with weeds and tangled vines. The house itself looked neglected, with papers and junk scattered across the porch. The front door was slightly ajar, its creaking hinges swaying in the breeze. My sense of unease grew, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. A few days later, the movers returned, taking out the last pieces of furniture. The house was now nearly empty. The sight of Mr. Thompson's belongings being removed, items once familiar and reassuring, added to the eerie feeling that something was terribly wrong. I spoke with a few neighbors to see if they knew anything. Most had noticed the movers but knew no more than I did. One elderly neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, mentioned she hadn't seen Mr. Thompson for a couple of weeks before the move. Her comment only heightened my concern. Finally, I decided to take a closer look. Once the movers were gone and the house stood empty, I found an opportunity. The front door was open and no one was around. The interior of the house was as eerie as its exterior, a shell of its former self with bare walls and dusty floors. The air was heavy with abandonment, carrying a sense that Mr. Thompson had simply vanished without a trace. While exploring, I stumbled upon a small, dusty office at the back of the house. On the desk lay an old leather-bound notebook. Curiosity got the better of me, and I flipped through its pages. The entries were strange and disjointed, filled with ramblings about being watched, feeling trapped, and a series of increasingly paranoid thoughts. The last few pages were scribbled with frantic notes about leaving, escaping, and never looking back. One entry, scrawled hastily, read, "They know. I have to go before it's too late. The shadows are closing in. I can't stay here." The unsettling tone of the journal made my skin crawl. It was as if Mr. Thompson had been living in constant fear, convinced that something or someone was after him. The finality of his words and the suddenness of his departure left me deeply unnerved. As I left the house, I glanced back at the now empty property. The front door swung lazily in the breeze, and the overgrown yard seemed to mirror the disarray and confusion of the events that had unfolded. Later, I learned from other neighbors that Mr. Thompson had not contacted anyone, not even to inform them of his departure. It was as if he had disappeared, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. The police were contacted, but without concrete evidence or a clear trail, they had little to go on. They closed the case as a missing person report but made no significant progress. The house remained empty for months, a haunting reminder of Mr. Thompson's disappearance. Eventually, new occupants moved in. They painted the walls and breathed new life into the home. Yet, the sense of unease never truly left. Every now and then, I found myself glancing at the house, wondering what had really happened to Mr. Thompson. The experience left me with a lingering dread, a realization that people can vanish without a trace, and the reasons behind their disappearance can be far more unsettling than we dare to imagine. Mr. Thompson's story became a cautionary tale in our community, a reminder that behind closed doors, secrets can fester, and in the shadows, darkness can silently envelop even the most ordinary of lives. I had always enjoyed the solitude of the mountains, especially in the fall when the leaves transformed into a breathtaking mosaic of reds and oranges. It was the perfect time for a weekend retreat, and I had found a secluded cabin online that promised peace and tranquility. Advertised as an off-the-grid escape, it was nestled deep in the woods, far from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Eager to experience a genuine escape from my busy schedule, I booked it immediately. When I arrived, the cabin was just as described: remote, rustic, and surrounded by dense forest. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of pine. It was a picturesque setting, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me as I unloaded my bags and settled in. The cabin itself was charming in a weathered sort of way, with wooden walls and a stone fireplace. It had everything I needed, or so I thought. The first night was peaceful. I cooked a simple meal, enjoyed a glass of wine, and read by the fire. The quiet of the forest was soothing, and the occasional rustling of leaves outside was more calming than alarming. I went to bed early, wrapped in the comfort of the cabin's cozy interior, and fell asleep quickly. The next morning, I woke up to find that the weather had taken a turn. The sky was overcast, and a steady rain began to fall, adding a new layer of isolation to the cabin. Undeterred, I decided to explore the area. I donned my raincoat and ventured out, taking a hike along the overgrown trails. The forest was even more enchanting in the rain, with the sound of raindrops creating a rhythmic patter on the leaves. After a few hours of hiking, I returned to the cabin, drenched but invigorated. I warmed up by the fire and decided to spend the rest of the afternoon relaxing. It was then that I noticed something odd. The cabin's front door, which I was certain I had locked, was slightly ajar. I brushed it off as a gust of wind or a mistake on my part and closed it securely. As evening approached, the storm outside intensified. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain beat relentlessly against the windows. The cabin's interior was warm and dry, a stark contrast to the tumultuous weather outside. I settled in for a quiet evening, but the howling wind and the constant drumming of rain created an unsettling atmosphere. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud banging noise. My heart raced as I listened carefully, trying to determine if it was just the storm or something more. The banging continued intermittently, coming from outside. I convinced myself it was likely just the wind causing something to hit against the cabin, but the noise was persistent and unnerving. I mustered the courage to investigate. Grabbing a flashlight, I made my way to the door, opening it carefully to peer into the dark, stormy night. The wind and rain obscured my vision, but I saw nothing unusual. I scanned the surrounding forest with the flashlight, but there were no signs of movement or disturbances. Relieved but still unsettled, I closed the door and locked it securely. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but the experience left me on edge. The next morning, the storm had subsided, leaving behind a wet and foggy landscape. The forest was eerily quiet, and I felt a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I decided to cut my trip short and return home, feeling that the cabin had already given me more than enough adventure. Before leaving, I took one last look around the cabin, ensuring I hadn't forgotten anything. It was then that I noticed something disturbing. The cabinet in the living room, which had been empty when I arrived, now contained a set of old, dusty books and various trinkets. The items seemed out of place and made me feel uneasy. I didn't remember seeing them before, and they were not listed in the cabin's amenities. As I gathered my belongings and prepared to leave, I noticed a small handwritten note on the kitchen counter. It was folded and yellowed with age. I unfolded it with trembling hands and read the message: "Welcome to my retreat. I hope you enjoyed your stay. Remember, not everyone finds their way out of the woods." A chill ran down my spine as I read the note. The message was cryptic and unsettling, leaving me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, that the seemingly idyllic cabin was hiding something sinister. I left the cabin quickly, driving away with a mix of relief and unease. The journey back home was quiet, and the further I got from the cabin, the more I tried to rationalize the events of the past few days. Maybe the banging was just the storm, and the note was a prank left by a previous guest. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered, and the cabin's strange atmosphere left an indelible mark on my memory. In the days that followed, I tried to put the experience behind me. I discussed it with friends who offered various explanations, from mischievous cabin owners to elaborate hoaxes. But no matter how many rational explanations I considered, the feeling of discomfort remained. The cabin, with its strange occurrences and eerie atmosphere, had left me with a lasting sense of unease. Eventually, the cabin disappeared from the rental listings, and I never saw it again. Whether it was taken off the market or something more sinister had happened, I couldn't say. But the memory of that isolated retreat, the unsettling note, and the feeling of being watched remained with me. It served as a stark reminder that sometimes, even the most peaceful escapes can harbor hidden fears, and that some places are better left unexplored. It was a typical October evening, with the crisp air and the scent of fallen leaves filling the streets. I was preparing for a quiet night in, settling into my favorite armchair with a good book. The house was peaceful, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors and the distant hum of traffic. It was the kind of tranquil night that made you appreciate the comfort of home. Little did I know, the tranquility was about to be shattered. Around midnight, as I was about to close the book and head to bed, the phone rang. It was an old rotary phone, the kind that still had a reassuringly tactile feel to it. I wasn't expecting any calls, especially not at this hour. With a sense of mild irritation, I picked up the receiver. "Hello," I said, my voice breaking the silence of the room. There was a long pause on the other end, filled with static and faint, irregular breathing. My annoyance quickly turned to concern as the breathing continued, becoming more erratic and heavy. I could barely make out the sound of a person shifting, as if they were trying to speak but couldn't find the words. "Hello? Who's there?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. The line remained silent except for the unsettling breathing. After a few moments, the line went dead. I checked the phone to ensure it was properly connected, then tried calling back. The call went straight to voicemail with no option to leave a message. I shrugged it off as a wrong number or a prank and decided to ignore it. Just as I was about to return to my book, the phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed no number, just unknown caller. My heart rate quickened, and I hesitated before answering. "Hello," I said again, trying to keep my tone neutral. This time, there was a voice on the other end, but it was distorted and barely intelligible. The voice was calm, but carried an undertone of something unsettling. It sounded almost mechanical, as if being manipulated through some device. "Are you alone?" the voice asked, its tone oddly clinical. I froze, trying to understand the question. "Who is this? Why are you calling me?" The voice ignored my questions. "Are you alone?" it repeated, this time with a hint of menace. A shiver ran down my spine. I looked around the room, feeling suddenly vulnerable. "Yes, I'm alone." "Why?" There was a pause, followed by a click. The line went dead again. I tried to call back, but the number remained unreachable. My anxiety grew, and I decided to check the locks on all the doors and windows. Everything seemed secure, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I tried to return to my book, but the eerie phone call had shattered my focus. Every creak of the house seemed amplified, and every shadow seemed darker. I decided to go to bed early, hoping that sleep would ease my nerves. As I lay in bed, trying to ignore the sound of the wind howling outside, I heard it again, the faintest sound of a phone ringing. It wasn't coming from inside the house, but seemed to be coming from outside. I lay there in the darkness, trying to determine if I was imagining things. The ringing persisted, growing louder and more insistent. Unable to ignore it any longer, I got up and crept to the window, peering out into the darkened street. There was nothing unusual, just the empty street and the occasional rustle of leaves. I checked the front and back doors again, making sure everything was locked tight. The eerie feeling persisted, but I managed to get back into bed, hoping the sounds would stop. Around 3 a.m., the phone rang once more. This time, I didn't hesitate. I picked up the receiver, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no response, only a strange, almost rhythmic clicking sound on the line. A faint echo of a heartbeat. It was the same unnerving breathing from before, but now it was accompanied by the sound of muffled whispers. I hung up, my mind racing. I decided to call the police, describing the strange calls and the unsettling noises. They assured me they would send someone to check things out, but didn't seem particularly concerned. I was left alone with my fear, waiting for the officers to arrive. When they did, they found nothing out of the ordinary. They checked the perimeter of the house and assured me that everything appeared secure. They suggested it might have been a prank or a wrong number and advised me to keep the phone line secure. Despite their assurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The calls continued over the next few days, always at odd hours and always with the same distorted voice asking if I was alone. Each time I would answer, but the calls would end with the same unsettling click or rhythmic breathing. The feeling of being watched or followed grew stronger, and I became increasingly paranoid. I tried to trace the calls, but the phone company was unable to provide any useful information. The number remained unknown, and the calls seemed to come from different sources, making it impossible to pinpoint their origin. The constant anxiety and fear took a toll on my daily life. I became hyper-aware of every sound and shadow. The once comfortable familiarity of my home now felt like a trap. I even started avoiding being alone, spending more time out of the house or with friends, hoping that the presence of others would offer some sense of security. One evening, I received a final, particularly disturbing call. The voice on the other end was calm, almost soothing, and it spoke clearly for the first time. "I'm outside. I can see you." My blood ran cold. I rushed to the windows, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing. I checked the locks once more and tried to calm my racing heart. The police were notified again, but their investigation turned up nothing. They found no signs of an intruder or any unusual activity in the area. The calls eventually stopped, as mysteriously as they had begun. I was left with a lingering sense of paranoia and an unsettling feeling that someone had been watching me from the shadows. The phone never rang at odd hours again, and the sense of dread gradually faded, though the memory of those calls remained vivid in my mind. The experience left me with a deep sense of unease and a realization that sometimes the most unsettling threats come from the most unexpected places. The mysterious calls served as a chilling reminder of how vulnerable we can feel, even within the safety of our own homes, and how quickly the comfort of familiarity can turn into a source of fear. It was a chilly October evening when I first noticed the smell. At first, I thought it was just the usual autumn musk, the damp, earthy smell of decaying leaves and the crispness of the changing season. But this odor was different, more pungent and unsettling. It seemed to seep into every corner of my home, no matter how many windows I opened or how much air freshener I used. The scent was unmistakable, a nauseating combination of rot and decay. I tried to ignore it, hoping it was just a temporary issue, but as days went by, the smell only grew stronger. It was as if it was emanating from the walls themselves. My neighbors, who I spoke to about the issue, hadn't noticed anything unusual. It seemed I was the only one affected. Determined to find the source of the odor, I began a thorough inspection of my house. I checked the attic, basement, and even the crawl spaces. I meticulously cleaned every nook and cranny, convinced that I must have missed something. But despite my efforts, the smell persisted, growing more intense with each passing day. One evening, while searching the attic, I found an old, dusty trunk I had never noticed before. It was a large wooden chest with intricate carvings, almost as if it were a relic from another era. The trunk was locked, but the smell was undeniably stronger near it. I hesitated, a gnawing sense of dread creeping up my spine, but curiosity got the better of me. I pried the trunk open with a crowbar, my hands trembling. Inside, the trunk was filled with old clothes, yellowed and tattered, along with several personal items, photographs, letters, and a diary. But what caught my eye was a collection of small sealed jars. The jars were filled with a dark, viscous liquid, and their contents had clearly been preserved for a long time. The sight was disturbing, but I couldn't make sense of it. I decided to take the jars to a local lab for analysis, hoping to identify the contents. While waiting for the results, the smell continued to invade my home. I decided to contact a local historian to find out more about the trunk. The historian, intrigued by the find, agreed to help. He visited my home and examined the trunk and its contents. As he flipped through the diary and photographs, his face grew pale. The historian explained that the trunk once belonged to a family who had lived in my house decades ago. They had mysteriously disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions. The diary, he revealed, belonged to the family's matriarch, who had written about strange occurrences and a growing sense of dread before their disappearance. The most disturbing part was the diary's final entries. They detailed the family's growing fear of an unseen presence, of something terrible that had been lurking in their home. The entries described the smell of decay that had grown unbearable, a scent that seemed to pervade the house and drive them to desperation. When the lab results came back, they revealed that the jars contained human remains, preserved in a gruesome and macabre fashion. The realization hit me hard. The smell I had been experiencing was not just a figment of my imagination or a seasonal odor. It was a lingering reminder of something truly horrifying. I was shaken both by the discovery and by the eerie connections to the family's story. The historian and I decided to contact the authorities, who conducted a thorough investigation. They found no further clues about the family's disappearance or any additional remains, but the case was reopened and the story made local headlines. Living in the house became increasingly difficult. The sense of unease grew stronger, and the smell seemed to cling to every surface, a constant reminder of the horror that had once occurred within its walls. I struggled to sleep, haunted by the thought of the family's fate and the unsettling knowledge that something terrible had happened in my home. The authorities eventually closed the case, but the story of the family and the macabre discovery became a part of local lore. I decided to move out, unable to shake the feeling of dread and the haunting scent that seemed to permeate every corner of the house. The new occupants eventually took over, and the house was cleaned and restored. However, the eerie history of the place remained a part of its dark past. To this day, I can't escape the memory of that smell, the scent of decay that lingered long after the trunk was opened and the remains were discovered. It serves as a grim reminder of the horrors that can be hidden in the most ordinary places and the unsettling truth that sometimes the past is not so easily buried.